Today we're with Emerita Professor Dr. Susan Shortland, a graduate of the University of Cambridge, someone who spent time working in publishing before joining the CBI, working then in consulting with KPMG, and then a distinguished career in academia. Sue, thank you very much indeed for joining us for the conversation today. I think a recurrent theme that I see throughout your work over all those years is the idea of mobility in an international context. Be good just to start the conversation, reflecting back to a chat I had with Duncan Brown recently when I said to him with his Paying for Contribution book, that ranged back over 25 years since it was first published in 1999. Could you range back over your interesting career and tell us the kinds of things that you've seen change and evolve over time?
Well, it goes back a long way. So, because I first started writing about relocation issues, mobility issues, when I first started out in research and writing in publishing. So it's spanning about 45 years. So that's a long way to look back, actually. And there's obviously been significant changes over that time. But I think to sort of summarize it really is in the early 1980s and going into the 90s, I think organizations pretty much focused on what's known as the balance sheet, which is the the home-based approach to pay, where you're trying to seek equity with home-based peers. And in essence, it's just, following on from the development of that sort of scheme of reward that came out of the oil industry, which is obviously one of the industries that's been relocating people around the world globally into challenging destinations for decades and decades. And there was a lot of focus really on that for many years. But it's quite an expensive way to mobilize people. So in theory, although in terms of reward, it's supposed to make people whole, in quotes, in fact, actually, they tend to be a lot better off. So it's quite expensive. But if you're quite a profitable industry like the oil industry, you can afford it. But as more industries have globalized, so during my days in the CBI, when we actually saw globalization really starting to, boom, more and more industry sectors were moving people globally, and they couldn't all really afford that kind of approach to pay. So we started to see trends towards a more modified approach to the balance sheet. So rather than trying to equate everything with the home country and, keeping people whole, but generally better off, there was some sort of cost trimmings going on. And so a lot of sort of focus on cost control and using that approach to pay, but trying to make it more cost effective for business. But it's still expensive, even if you're using a modified approach. So then we started to see the takeoff of more host-based approaches to pay, where you're trying to provide equity for people who are moving internationally with the local workforces. But the drawback with that is it doesn't tend to work very well if you're sending people into low pay countries, because no one wants to go to somewhere that's lower pay. And it also doesn't work very well if you're sending someone to a high pay country because they don't want to come back again. So again, it was sort of, it was a bit limited, the degree to which it was being used, but companies were exploring it. And we started to see sort of more host plus type approaches. So not just local pay, but some plus elements to reflect the fact that people were mobile. Things like housing, children's education, and so on would be covered. And in essence, everything revolved pretty much around long-term assignments, and assignments were like 5 years. They were quite lengthy. But as time has gone on, so the trend has been to shorten the length of assignments, to increasingly use what are called short-term assignments. So they tend to be somewhere between 3 months and a year maximum, usually about 6 months. And therefore policies had to be developed for those. And today, that's probably, I think more companies have got policies for short-term assignments than they have for long-term assignments. So we've seen a shortening of the lengths. So a lot of use of these short-term assignments, and long-term assignments are probably now in the UK probably 2 to 3 years, not 3 to 5 years. So that's been reduced down. But the other trend I think that's come on stream more recently is more policies to cover different types of mobility. So for the mobility professional, they're coping with things like commuter assignments, where people don't move their families and they just commute on a weekly basis, monthly basis, bi-monthly, something like that. Rotational assignments. So they were used in challenging industries like oil and gas and mining and so on, where you rotate people in and out. And now those sorts of assignments are actually being used by other industry groups who are also entering areas that simply don't have expatriate infrastructure in place. So we're seeing that. And more recently, I mean, now there's a trend towards so-called one-way assignments, one-way transfers, which aren't really one-way because people tend to come back, but it's a way of actually saying that you're not going to be that mobile. You know, your idea is you go out there for some time, but you're on more local or host plus type terms and conditions. So the range of assignments has got wider, and the types of policies people are using have mushroomed. So there's lots and lots of different policies in the suite. But the thing to say about that, and I don't want to sort of prolong it too long because I could probably talk for hours about it, but the thing to say about that is although that there are more policy types, organizations, I think, more recently have realized they've got themselves almost straitjacketed into, well, it's this sort of policy or that sort of policy. It's a managerial policy, it's a strategic policy, it's a developmental policy, it's a short term, it's a long term, it's a commuter. But at the end of the day, you sort of box yourself in and you put somebody in a bucket, and then you've got issues to do with, well, what if that doesn't really work for them? So we're seeing more in the way of flexibility today in terms of policy design, and a trend now to move towards more a guideline approach rather than a straitjacket policy approach. And that's all tied up with talent and getting a wider range of talent out there, and also meeting local business needs as well. So you're trying to always balance the employee experience with business requirements. So it's a wide-ranging area, and over the years, it's just become I think, more challenging for global mobility professionals to actually work out exactly what is the best thing to do. Because if you can't encourage people to go and they won't stay and they don't perform, then whatever you're doing isn't good enough, is it? So you've got to have something that motivates people to go and retains people in position once they're there.
Very interesting. You said, going back to your CBI days, globalization was the thing that was really taking off. Do you think we've still got globalization, or has there been a reaction to it that is further complicating the context within which mobilization of people needs to be managed?
I think that's become quite a big academic debate, isn't it, as to whether globalization is still around or not. I think for certain companies, it's their desire to globalize, or their desire to internationalize and to actually spread their wings, if you like, and to sell their wares, their goods, their services globally is the way they will be expanding. I think the way people are globalizing, or firms are globalizing, has changed. So we're not seeing the sort of greenfield starts, new startups where people just go to a new location and just try and do it all on their own. The pressure is on, if you're going to, in quotes, globalize, to do it with a partner. So there's far more in the way of joint ventures, sort of mergers, acquisitions, those kind of approaches to it. In terms of how you define it and whether you still call it globalization, I think, you know, the big boys have already done it, haven't they? The big firms are already out there. They've already got a global reach, although they are still trying to go into new locations, countries that are newly industrializing and are still very challenging for them. But the globalization side of it, for I think smaller firms and firms that haven't internationalized before, still presents a major challenge. How you define it becomes an academic debate. That's the only thing I'd say. I'm sort of sidestepping that one.
Give me a politician's answer.
I'm not sidestepping it, because I think that, you know, I think the major firms, they are global players. But there is an issue about how you would define it, the globalization, in terms of global mobility, on a serious note. Because if you're going to take a very global approach, you would be resourcing your business globally. And the issue is it's very difficult to resource a business globally because you've got all the different regimes with their, visa regimes and various sort of legal aspects that make it quite difficult for you to draw the best talent from anywhere in the world. So if you're defining globalization in terms of global mobility as to how you resource your business, I think all firms are up against it because it is very difficult to move people around with the degree of freedom that businesses might wish if they're drawing the best talent from anywhere in the world. So I think we are still seeing quite, an emphasis on home-based approaches to staffing up businesses or headquarters-based approaches, but with also an effort to draw more from local labour markets rather than a global spread of resources drawing from all across the world.
And we also tend to think about this in terms of the Anglophone countries, or say at least the European, large European countries, sending out business and talent around the world. But we're in a very different, in quotes, global environment with, say, the BRICS countries now, and the fact that we're seeing expatriation, not just from the Anglophone or the Europeans going out there, but you've got China, you've got maybe South Africa, you've certainly got India, and some large South American countries. How's that impacted on the mix and how people ought to start thinking about mobilisation and the way you reward and recognise it?
That's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, sort of you say about the BRIC countries, but it's not just always been the sort of the Anglo-based countries, because Japan has been a major, globalizing force in terms of Japanese companies setting up around the world for a very long time. And interestingly, Japan or Japanese companies are some of the major users of the balance sheet. They still use primarily the home-based system. And of course, they have a very long-term time orientation, so they tend to have very lengthy assignments as well. So it's quite interesting that even though they're not, you couldn't say that they're from the Anglosphere, but at the same time, they're actually copying or following a very kind of American approach, but with a longer time horizon. In terms of what the other nations are doing, I mean, yeah, you're obviously seeing a lot of sort of Chinese businesses, for example, entering some of the challenging nations in Africa, for example, Indian businesses entering nations across the world. But at the end of the day, in terms of how you reward people, there's not huge numbers of choices in terms of globally mobile personnel. So you have like your home-based system where you're trying to maintain equity with the home peers. You have the host-based system where you're trying to maintain equity with local nationals. Or you have the sort of globalist system where you're trying to set up a payment reward system where you've got your comparators are other globally mobile people. So home, host, or global are effectively the three choices. Some examples perhaps of regional pay. So, if you're moving to a region where you've got fairly comparable pay across a group of countries, you might use those. But at the end of the day, your choices in international reward aren't huge. Home, host, global, that's it. So in terms of what these other companies are doing, interestingly, there's not huge amounts of research on those. I mean, there seems to be quite a lot of research now starting to come out of places like China and Taiwan and so on. But still, most of the academic research tends to be quite Western in its focus, with a lot of the researchers being from North America and Europe and Australia as well. So it's the traditional sending locations which still seem to have the bulk of the researchers who are doing the studies, and often their research is limited to where they have access, and that tends to be in the Western world.
So possibly some opportunities for people who want to explore those avenues. And I guess the other area, we obviously tend to think about it in the context of managed international mobilization, managed packages. But what about the self-initiated international mobilization of people? people who don't necessarily have access to any of those conventional packages, whether they're generous or less generous. Are there any things to think about the self-initiated expats?
I think that's quite an important area because people tend to self-initiate their expatriation for their own sort of career purposes, or it could be for family reasons, or it could be just, wanderlust and wanting to explore the world or whatever. But the issue tends to be for the self-initiated is that they don't tend to get the same sort of support that the organisationally assigned expatriates would get. So typically, organisationally assigned expatriates do get things like the preparatory training, and they get the sort of cultural understanding, they get preparation and training for that. And obviously they get pay packages that tend to represent the fact that they are globally mobile. They might have housing in two places or whatever. Whereas the self-initiated tend to move for their own career or move for their own interest, but then they're competing with locals on local terms and conditions, and they don't tend to get terribly much in the way of support. And that's an interesting area because obviously they may not be culturally au fait with how things are done in that country, and that can be a disadvantage to them in the workplace in terms of simply being able to function productively. So there is an argument that if you're going to take on self-initiated expatriates who are living in the country where you have your company's operations, that providing some form of preparatory cultural training could be quite useful. An interesting point about self-initiated expatriates is you actually see a different mix in terms of the gender base as well. So it tends to be fairly equal numbers in terms of men and women who would self-initiate their expatriation, whereas in organisationally assigned expatriation, you tend to see a greater proportion of men. So that's women seem to be stuck at about a third of the expatriate total. So that's interesting. So that's something that organisations might want to consider if they're thinking about diversity aspects as well, if they are employing self-initiated expatriates.
Interesting indeed. And we can't let this bit of the conversation pass without, the elephant in the room, the era of COVID and now post-COVID lockdowns, working from home, getting people to return to the office domestically. What about in the international context? I mean, I guess there's been a lot of virtual working internationally, not just domestically, but any things that you've been thinking about on that front?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, during COVID, obviously, people got stuck in countries there where they didn't want to be for quite some time. And then and a lot of the assignments were carried out virtually. And I think it's demonstrated that some things can be done virtually, but there's a lot of jobs which can't. So if you want to fulfill a leadership role, trying to do that via Zoom isn't, the best way to go about it. And also jobs, engineering and production type jobs, you've got to physically be there. So we have seen the dip in expatriation, obviously during COVID, and now it's going back up again. So it's on the rise. But in terms of what individuals want to do, people have got used to working from home, and they like it, and they like working from anywhere, which is the sort of the new sort of buzz phrase, I suppose. But working from anywhere causes problems in the sense that, what about the compliance issues, the jurisdictions that you're working in? So there are sort of tax issues associated with it and visa issues associated with it. So companies do need to be quite careful allowing people to work from anywhere on an expatriate sort of basis. Working from home, I think there's an issue there. If you've got an expatriate who you've sent out on an assignment, typically you're paying about 3 times the cost of their home-based salary to keep them in that location. So there is an argument that, local people expect to see their face in the office, not to have them working from home. But on the other hand, people have got used to this idea of having some time to work from home. It does give you sort of some headspace, I suppose. It's time when you can settle down and actually get things done, physically written, if you have to do that without having people seeing you all the time. So I think there is more flexibility in allowing expatriates to do that, but not to the extent that it's going to jeopardize the relationships with local people. And something that organizations must consider is that if you're going to let expatriates work from home 1 day a week, are you letting local people work from home 1 day a week? You know, where's the equity, I guess is what I'm saying. And if you want to have sort of more harmonious relationships and the expatriate to actually be successful in managing their projects and leading the people, they do need to, you know, I suppose, you know, be on the same sort of terms, or in terms of, you know, ability of coming into the office or working from home as you would your local workforce, because otherwise it's probably just going to cause discontent.
Yes. So trying to pull the lens back a bit now and thinking about it from organizations' point of view, almost take a corporate governance perspective now on mobilizing talent internationally. What do you think are the priorities that organizations are bringing into focus for reward management on the one hand? On the other hand, informed by research and thinking, what priorities do you think organizations should be focusing
on? I think that there is definitely a focus on transparency now, and on communication, because if whatever you're offering, it's got to be attractive. It's got to motivate people, as I said before. It's got to attract them, and it's got to retain them, and it's got to ensure that they are productive in what they do. But it has to be transparent, because that sort of underpins equity, and it's equity amongst and between the different groups. Because if you're putting people on different policies, which you probably are going to, you're not going to pay a volunteer the same or give them the same benefits as you're going to pay, I don't know, a senior leader, for example, or a developmental assignee or a new graduate. But you've got to make it very clear why people are on the policy they're on, or why they're getting what they're getting, and demonstrate equity among the same group. So we're not necessarily going to see equity between different groups or different types of transfers, but we want to see equity among. So I think the idea of transparency and equity is a strong one. And communication to ensure people actually understand what they're getting, because you can't really be motivated by anything if you don't understand what it is. If it's too complicated, it's not terribly helpful. But I think the other key area is this notion of flexibility. So as I mentioned before, rather than just straitjacketing people into a policy and saying, well, you can't have that, and if you want it, you have to claim an exception, and then you've got to go through the exception management process, to actually have flexibility so that people can, I won't go as far as say pick and choose, but so that they can tailor what they need to their own individual circumstances. And the trend, I would say, is towards ensuring that people, if you like, don't have to ask. Nobody wants to be an exception. Nobody. You don't want to have to ask for something. But everybody's family situation and circumstances are likely to be different. So there needs to be a degree of flexibility, but maintaining equity as well, so that people can actually take elements of the policy that assist them and help them to move, without them having to go cap in hand to management saying, oh, well, I need this because it's embarrassing and you don't want to have to do that. And with flexibility comes the ability to widen your talent base, because more people are likely to be willing to go if they don't feel they have to stand out and point out their differences. And they're more likely to be willing to undertake an assignment if they feel that their own circumstances are going to be met. And in terms of reward professionals, I think the only other point I'd make on that is that, excuse me, global mobility is probably, and domestic mobility, it's probably the only area in HR that involves the family. Because when you move somebody, you don't just move Stephen Perkins or Sue Shortland, you're moving their family as well. You're moving their, partners and their potentially their children. And no other aspect of HR really does that. HR just doesn't get involved with the family to any great degree. But when you're moving people, I think one of the key things that sets global mobility professionals apart is the fact they have to have an understanding of that family dynamics and whether the family are able to move and the sorts of things that they might need to assist them in a new location. Because it is a huge, huge change. You're not just moving an employee going from one work site to another work site. You've got a partner who may or may not be able to work. You've got children who may or may not be able to study in the same language in the schools. You've got issues about, and it sounds trivial, but it's not, family pets. You know, what do you do with the family pet? And how do people make friends? How do they make sort of social connections? How do they fit into a new society? And that's an area which I think companies are increasingly realizing that it actually forms part of this very broad overall reward package. You've got to look after the family as well, because people are not moving on their own. And even if you're not taking the family with you and you're going on an unaccompanied assignment, you're splitting families apart. And then you've got issues about, you know, for the assignee themselves, loneliness and, you know, unhappiness and breakdown of family relationships. So these are things that seriously have to be taken into account.